Well, welcome back, everyone. This conference today is going to be a little bit different from some formats that we've had before. While two of our speakers are going to be giving a talk from the front, and we've had one of those, the other two are going to make their contributions in the form of a conversation. We're really looking at the way in which Christian faith and a career in science interact in people's lives. And so we've got two of our speakers today who are just going to answer some questions for us about those aspects of their lives. So I'm going to introduce our next contributor, who is Dr. Cecilia Brassett. I'm not going to say very much about biography because it's going to come out in the conversation. But Nathan was saying something about people with a mainly teaching post. That's what Cecilia does. She's a teaching professor officially. And her background is medicine, though she has been medicine and surgery. She has done some other interesting things in her life which are going to come out in our conversation. So thank you very much, Cecilia, for coming along to do this today. I'm going to start by asking if you can tell us just briefly where you originally come from and how you came to Christian faith.
So I was born in Hong Kong. My parents were nominal Christians. They went to church, but Jesus didn't really figure very much in our family, apart from going to church on Sundays. And everything was going very well. I was very happy at school. But one day when I was 15, my father unexpectedly dropped dead in our home one evening. He was 50. He was pretty healthy before that. There were no kind of signs, and we didn't have time to say goodbye. So at the time, I wondered what the purpose of life was, if it could be just snuffed out in a moment like that. And the sort of corny questions you ask, you know, who am I? I know my name, but what's the point of living a good life if in the end we all end up as minerals in the soil? So I started looking for God. But because I was a science student, I needed good evidence that Christianity was true. And so I investigated a lot of things like reliability of Bible manuscripts, evidence for Jesus' resurrection, read the Bible for myself, and was also very impressed by the difference that the Christian faith made in the lives of those around me, and particularly in a church that a friend took me to. So I gave my life to Jesus Christ, specifically at a meeting where a Bible verse was put on the board, which was Luke 19:10, the Ceclia story, where Jesus said, "The Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost." And it was at that meeting I realized I was the one who was lost and that Jesus had come to seek and save me. So I repented and asked him to change me. So that was about 45 years ago now.
So that's in your early life then, when you said that you were already a science student.
Well, I mean,
so you were studying science at school.
What they were called, what yes. We called O levels and A levels.
Indeed. So let's look at that side of your experience then, and ask what were the circumstances that brought you into studying medicine, and how your Christian faith influenced that choice.
I decided to study medicine primarily because when my father died, the attending doctor actually was very abrupt. I was 15 at the time. I had no medical background, and I asked what my father had died of, and he said two words, myocardial infarction, which I didn't understand at the time. So at that night, I determined to be a different kind of doctor. I hadn't become a Christian then. I mean, I thought I was a Christian, but I wasn't really a Christian at that point. But coming to Cambridge to study medicine, however, wasn't actually what I wanted to do. I didn't want to leave my mother alone. After I became Christian, I knew that God wanted me to actually honor my mother and look after her. So I didn't want to come at all. So God had to convince me, and He did some amazing things to force me to come. And one of the most important things, a couple of things, that my brother, who's 13 years older than I am, came back from the States to look after my mother. He hadn't intended to do that. And then an anonymous, I don't know whether he was billionaire or billionaire, gave me some, paid my fees so that I could come. So I suppose, you know, I was led to come, pushed into it.
Would you say there's some similarity there with the story in the Bible of Gideon, who asked God to do things to demonstrate that's what he really wanted?
Possibly, because I knew he wanted me to love my mother, so that was clear. But whether he wanted me to come to Cambridge to study medicine is not as clearly put in the Bible. So I had to know whether I should leave her, I think, because she was completely devastated after my father died. And I didn't want to have a bad witness as a Christian to say, well, look, you know, I'm just going to pursue my whatever and leave you.
So the opportunity basically opened up, and it was fairly clear that you felt that was God's guidance, yes, that he wanted you to go and study medicine at Cambridge.
Yes.
Which you did,
which I did.
And did very well and succeeded and went on into surgical career. And I think you were very successful in that early career and found it very satisfying, didn't you?
Mm-hmm, yes.
And how did that become a problem for you?
Well, it's very helpful, Nathan's talk. you see when so I qualified, decided to become a surgeon. I wanted to work overseas. So initially, the choice of surgery was because it's more helpful in developing countries to be a surgeon rather than to give them drugs which you don't have. But surgery became an addiction. So you're talking about science, but surgery is even more addictive. Particularly in my era, where most surgery is open surgery, not like nowadays you have keyhole surgery, which is not as fun for the surgeon. Open surgery is very exciting. You know, the thrill of operating, because I was an abdominal surgeon, scrabbling around in the abdomen, blood everywhere, blood on the glasses, blood on the mask, blood on your boots. That is life. The adrenaline is I mean, you're sort of adrenaline junkie, really, and you're in theatre day and night, and you know, it became a complete obsession. And I think you're right that when something else takes the place of God and become an idol, then everything falls apart. And so my spiritual and emotional life went downhill. I became a very, very different person. And my attitudes and behavior were not Christ-like at all. You know, I started behaving like a surgeon, basically. I started shouting at colleagues, drove very, very fast. I don't even possess a car now. And that's not because I can't drive, but because you know, there's no need for a car now, but I was speeding down the motorway a lot. And then the last straw came when I realized that I was changing, you know, my personality was changing. It's not at all what a Christian should be. And the last straw came when one of my junior doctors, when he was leaving, gave me a gift. And, you know, British people, tongue-in-cheek, you know, it's a joke, but he gave me a book which was entitled How to Look After Your Rottweiler. And the Rottweiler was me. Yeah. So, and it took me aback. I mean, it was a joke, but it was really, you know, Yeah, it was very true, I think. And then, you know, also another doctor, junior doctor that I used to teach, you know, teach him how to operate. He said, well, you say you're a Christian and you want to look after people and love people and help people, but what you really love is cutting, isn't it? And so I think, you know, people can see what you really love. So I knew something had to change.
It's always interesting on these occasions when you have talks that have been put together and contributions from different people, how you find some quite interesting overlaps between them. And certainly Nathan's comment about idolatry of science, which is something I think we all recognise. It is interesting how that's coming out in your story. The good point about Cecilia's story is that she recognised it and wanted to do something about it. And an awful lot of people I know, their idolatry of their work is something that's there throughout their life, and it spoils them. You're getting quite a bit of reaction here from our hearers about descriptions of surgical operations. I think we'll not dwell on that too much. So you recognised that you were having a problem in that your work had become far too important to you. It was your driving ambition, it was your idol. Mm-hmm. What did you decide to do about it, and why?
Yes, I mean, it was other people who actually noticed it, as you can see. But I knew I had to make a choice between surgery and God. And at that time, interestingly, I was working on a vascular unit, and that means we looked after patients who had problems with their blood vessels, so usually blocked vessels because of smoking or diabetes or other conditions. And often they would present with gangrenous limbs, black feet and so on. So I did quite a few amputations in those days. I mean, now we have more minimally invasive techniques like angioplasty, where you don't have to do so many, you know, bypass surgery, which failed and then led to amputations. But when I was sort of dealing with my idolatry, I, as I said, I did a lot of amputations, but I was really surprised to find that my most grateful patients were my amputees. It's actually really hard to consent someone for an amputation. You know, you go to a patient and say, look, sorry, we have to take off your leg. It's not an easy thing to say to them. But when you have a gangrenous leg, and I hope none of you will experience that, you're actually in pain all the time. We call it night pain is terrible. And you can't walk, and you're, because of the infection that's coursing around your system, you're actually ill all the time. You feel terrible. But once the amputation has been done, in fact, you know, and the artificial leg fitted, you're no longer in pain and you can walk. And I remember, actually, one of my patients wrote me a thank you card. In fact, several did, you know, and he put, thank you, doctor, for taking off my leg. Because of that, I can now walk again. It sounds paradoxical, but it was true. And then, I mean, you see, God is very kind. I think he needed to sort of drum it into my head. Despite these two colleagues, I was still doing surgery. And I realized what God was teaching me was that my addiction to surgery was my gangrenous limb. And that he reminded me of what Jesus said, which is very, very clear. If your right eye offends you, cut it out. Because it's better to go to, you know, go to heaven maimed than whole to hell. And if your right hand offends you, cut it off. The same concept. He's talking about sin, of course, and what impedes us, you know, not obstructs us in our Christian life, but in fact, it's the same thing. So my surgery, my idolatry to surgery was my gangrenous limb, and I have to make the choice of whether to get rid of it or not. And the choice was very stark. Can I live without God? Can I live without surgery? I mean, it's a no-brainer. Most of you probably live without surgery, don't you? I mean, you don't have to cut open people to have satisfaction. I hope not, anyway. So I made a decision, and it was a hard decision because I had a very good job, and in fact I had to resign twice because then I did a research degree which was in molecular genetics, in order to wean myself off, because you couldn't be a surgeon one day and not a surgeon the next. It's really difficult. So I was able to do a few locums, and I mean now it's maybe a bit more difficult. So I would, during my research degree, I'd go into to do a bit of operating, just to, so that it's not cold turkey. It's too difficult if it is. Yeah. So it made me whole again. I mean, it took a few years for me to become normal, and then my goals were correctly aligned. I think one night I remember that my husband said that I was, he was always worried that I would just suddenly, get up and take a knife and started cutting him up or something, because I was because I needed it, needed a fix.
So, in fact, in making what is effectively an amputation of yourself, of your career there, you went off to do something completely different, didn't you?
Yes, so after the research degree, I was weaned off, so that was all right. And then my husband, who's not a medic, and who's incredibly patient, he's just so kind, and I retrained as linguists, and worked among an ethnic minority group in South Central China with a Christian organization that's very close, that used to be very close to here, for some years as field linguists. And my scientific training was very useful because obviously we were still collecting data, analyzing linguistic data, which is very similar to biological data. It's not very kind of precise data sometimes. And you were sort of observational anthropologist, so it was very interesting. We had to write some linguistic papers, a couple of books as part of our contract with that university and we were working with an unwritten language that we were looking at. Of course, at the same time, we were also being Christians in that place. I mean, my medical training also came to useful because our expat colleagues would fracture things, or their children would have problems, and I'd go with them to hospital. In fact, we were there when the SARS epidemic was on, so I had to accompany some of them to hospital.
So that was a completely different direction of work in a different part of the world. And you would say then that was a sort of final cure for you, I suppose. What was the relationship at that time then between your scientific ambitions, if you still had scientific ambitions, and your Christian faith? I mean, how were they interacting when you were doing that?
I mean, as I explained, I think a good university education, which I think I believed I got, you have a lot of transferable skills, and linguistics, as I said, collecting data, analyzing data, doing a phonology of the language is still the same. It's a scientific endeavor. We were very interested in that, and as I said, we wrote some papers, linguistic papers. So it's very similar. You're using your mind to discover things about that culture, and we were very happy in that academic environment. And in fact, that's why my children were very pleased that I wasn't a surgeon when they were born. I mean, it was after I gave up that I had my two children. And one of them is a linguist, so she did French and Arabic at uni, and she speaks about 4 or 5 languages, because we were linguists when they were young. And my son, because where we were living, we were often the water would come out of the water that came with the taps would be brown, and we'd had to boil it and then filter it in order to drink it, compared to the water in the villages, which was sort of, well, we just got it from a spring. And so he's a water consultant now. So yeah, so it's kind of, I mean, they didn't become scientists in that, you know, in the pure science way, but they're still scientists in a different way, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
So how did you come back into the medical field and end up where you are now?
So we had to return to the UK because of different circumstances. We were actually intending to stay for a bit longer, but my son was very ill and he almost died, and God very kindly healed him. Well, that's another story. My husband had a major relapse of his post-viral syndrome after another illness. It's a bit much like long COVID. It's more recognized now, so we couldn't stay. So we came back and I retrained. The worst thing about retraining are the exams you have to take, because I thought, you know, once I'd done my surgical exams, that was it. And I had retrained as a professional interpreter and translator. But then God had to work on me for several years before I got my current job in 2009, because at the beginning of my career as an interpreter, and that also relates to what you were saying about humility, when I was interpreting for patients in hospitals, this was the hospital I trained at, I would always make sure that, you know, the consultant knew I used to be a surgeon and that kind of thing, because I was still, you know, you wanted to tell people because of our pride. Because most people think of interpreters as being rather ignorant. They think interpreters don't actually know anything. They just know the language. Do you see what I mean? That they don't know anything about the subject they're actually interpreting for. But gradually I realized that, you know, my identity lay in being a child of God, not what I was or what I am. So it doesn't actually matter. And so I remember the day, I mean, it took God several years to sort of, you know, cut me down to shape. And I remember the day when I was, I mean, you know, remember that I used to be a surgeon and I used to teach anatomy as well. And so the day I came when I was interpreting for a consultant, and he asked me, do you know where the liver is? And in the past, I would have been really riled by that and would immediately say, well, actually, I was, you know, so-and-so. But I'd learned. And I said to him, yeah, I do. It's fine, you know. Because he just wanted me to be able to interpret it correctly to the client. So I think it was when I realized that it actually doesn't matter, that God then gave me this amazing job, teaching anatomy in Cambridge to all the medical students. And, you know, which is quite incredible. I mean, it's not what I was trying to do when I gave up surgery, if you see what I mean. So anyway.
So what vision would you say you have now for the way ahead, and how would you say God is guiding you in it?
I mean, everyone on my team knows I'm a Christian. Helps me to ensure that, you know, what I say and what I do are reflective of what a Christian should be and what Jesus would want. I think there's a lot of forgiveness and love that is required in an academic job, and kindness goes a long way. I mean, vision for the future, just another interesting thing, is that when I first became a Christian in Hong Kong, I thought that God was calling me to serve him in what was then known as Eastern Europe, in those days because the Iron Curtain was still up. But God showed me at that time, when I was about 19, 20, that's another story, clearly that it wasn't the right time for me to go. But then, when he later called us to China, I thought that was a replacement, if you see what I mean, for Eastern Europe. But to cut a long story short, this is too long to tell you how it happened, but it was then 40 years to the day that God told me I wasn't going to Eastern Europe, that I found myself in the Czech Republic on an academic visit as a visiting professor, visiting Czech Christians, and they were singing happy birthday to me for my 60th birthday in Czech. I had waited for 40 years for my vision to be fulfilled, and every time I think about it, I'm still really moved. There's no time to tell you the story of that, but I'm currently involved in quite a lot of academic projects with universities in the Czech Republic, Hungary and Croatia, and I also work with Christians in the Czech Republic and Hungary as well, in Central Europe. So God's guidance is very clear on this. I mean, and you find as Christians is that God is miles ahead of us, and we just need to follow and run to keep up with what he's doing. So it's very exciting. Every day is an exciting day.
So Cecilia, your experiences through your scientific and other related career and your Christian faith, some of those are way beyond the experience that many of us are going to have, and yet other things very much overlap with something that's true for all of us. I'm going to ask you, the last question is, what advice from your experience and your understanding would you give to a Christian in the early stages of a scientific career?
Well, I mean, very much what Nathan was saying about humility and charity. You must be a good scientist. I think that's very important. You must be rigorous in your pursuit of truth and in presentation of data. None of this fraudulent stuff that you were talking about. And then be a kind mentor. I think being kind is a big thing. And important to be generous with your knowledge, sharing things, to encourage younger people, if you're an older person. And then, of course, you know, or hopefully from my story you would have picked up that perhaps you should be wary of your career becoming an idol. Not perhaps, but definitely. Particularly when you enjoy your work as much as I did. And if you enjoy your work very much, it's actually very easy for it to become an idol. My son is very, very, very clear on this because he knows my story, obviously. And so he can actually save himself before he becomes like that. So, and, you know, keep your eyes focused on Jesus, of course.
Thank you very much. Now, Cecilia knew what those questions were going to be. She doesn't know what questions you might ask her, but you have the opportunity now to do that. I think that Shui Yang is going to bring a roving mic around, and we'll watch out for any that may be online from Matt there. So would you like to see who would like to ask a question?
Thank you so much for that. Just wondered if you could share some examples or ways that you see God at work in your current position as teaching professor at Cambridge. What kind of ways do you see sort of God moving in your department with your students as someone who's known as being a Christian in your role?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy in some ways to share your life. I mean, I've given a lot of talks, similar talks like this to medical societies, and students are always very keen to hear your own life journey. So I've not found it difficult to share, and and because of that, then obviously you have to be very careful because they're in a vulnerable position. You are in a position of sort of power. But when they've graduated, you know, you can be much more open. You can read the Bible with them. You can love them, and I mean, I have very, very close relationships with many colleagues and many students. Usually after they've qualified, for example. Yeah. And I mean, I have students I mean, very sadly, you know, when I'm also a fellow of a college and a tutor, so that's apart from my university job, departmental job. And sadly, you know, each year we have students who lose one or other of their parents, because this is when, you know, in their 50s is where, sadly, people die. And so I can relate to them, and I can share my own story, and it's quite natural. I think that the important thing is to say it right at the beginning. So the first day that I see all my students, then I'll say it, because that keeps you on track. Whereas it's very difficult to say that you're a Christian, you know, several months into the job, or several years, and they say, "Oh, I didn't know," and you know, and then maybe particularly if your then behavior doesn't fit what they think a Christian should be, then that's really bad.
Hi. So I just had a question. So because we're kind of mostly scientists as well, I speak for myself at least, I suffer from a lot of intellectual pride. And some of the things you said as a kind of surgeon really resonated. But I find sometimes it almost doesn't matter what the topic is. It seems to pop up. Even when I'm reading theology, I suddenly want to be to know everything, and it can almost become a bit toxic as well. Did you find that transitioning jobs, it still kept popping up? The same kind of, when you moved into linguistics, that you kind of now, that same kind of demon from surgery was appearing here? Or did that was there a really noticeable transition in your own thinking?
Well, I mean, pride is something we all struggle with every day, I would have thought. But yes, I mean, if you want to do everything well, then I suppose it's a balance between wanting to do things well, and then the tension between, is glorifying God the most important thing rather than glorifying yourself? And I guess you were talking about the, you know, worshipping reputation. Is that so important to you? And so, yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, we deal with it every day. I mean, and, but I think hopefully people can see that that's not all that you're wanting. And that's why I think being kind to people, I mean, I don't know what it's like in your department, but just congratulating people on their achievements is a rare thing. Do you see, you have sort of general congratulations, but I think individually you can still do that and be kind, and I think that's actually the hardest thing, isn't it? Rejoicing in other people's achievements, that marks you out, rather than, you know what I mean? Yes. You know, it's easy to keep quiet.
Yes, our friend here slightly preempted my question, but I want to pursue it a bit more, because you used the word idol, and you were a good surgeon. You like cutting, I can't think of a word.
Very much.
Cutting up the abdomen, I can't think of it. At the sight, I've fainted, people taking blood from my thumb, so I'm just a surveyor. I look at buildings, they're pretty disgusting things you do with buildings, but lift up manholes. Yeah. But I can't think of a job I would not want if I had the nous to do it. But great that you did it. I really, no, I mean, I think picking up what you were saying, which is really interesting, making an idol. You were good at your job. Presumably they wouldn't come back for you to do that. And yet you said that was becoming an idol that got in the way of God. I think that's important. I wish more people in this country were good at their job. I mean, in whatever field. I mean, I don't think they take it seriously. And that worries me, that you could be saving people from gangrene and things like that. I mean, good that you're doing your job. But where's the demarcation? Where do you cross the Rubicon to, this is an idol getting in the way? I mean, could you explore that? Because I think all of us struggle with pride. I think that's the biggest sin, isn't it? You know, the fall was pride, really. How that gets in the way, but of doing your job well, which I think God would say, you know, or Jesus would say, do your job properly. Every worker's worth his salary. I contend with that a bit. I take my job very seriously. I get sued. I'm a surveyor, so I get sued if I get it wrong. But actually, it's in my DNA, I suppose. It's just, and maybe my Christian ethic. I'm going to do my job to the best of my ability without fear or favour. But I don't think I'm making it an idol. But clearly, in your case, you said it got in the way of your relationship with God. Could you explore that? Because I'm deeply interested in that.
Yes,
that conflict.
Thank you. I guess it's the time you spend, you know, the time, you know, your thoughts and your passion, if that takes over your life and your waking hours, that's all you really want to do, rather than you want to glorify God. I mean, I was still trying to witness to patients. You know, I wasn't completely saying, you know, I'd given up being a Christian. I never did. But it's what you really want in life. And that was very clear. And again, the other problem is falling into sin, you know, being then tempted to do things that were wrong. I mean, when I used to speed, you know, because I at one stage I worked in Essex, but I lived in Cambridge, and I had to drive down the M11 and you know, about 100 miles an hour, because I used to go. Yeah, I realized that. You know, when I used to have to go really early, so I'd get up at 5 and then get down there, and my husband would very patiently say, just take your foot off the accelerator. It's okay to drive slower. But no, I mean, he wasn't there in the car. But you know, I think the other thing that I have as a good principle is that whatever you do, hold it very loosely, because it could be taken from you tomorrow. I mean, there are a lot of surgeons who do very well, but then sadly they then get ill, you know, they have, you know, arthritis or something, and then that's it. You know, they can't do it. But if it's your idol, then you collapse. But if it's not, then you will still be able to carry on normally, if you see what I mean.
It's not the rock on which you put it in my terms, the foundation you're built on. That's your faith that underlays everything. I think I can see where you're coming from, but I still think doing your job well is important.
Of course, yes. I mean, I'm not saying all surgeons are like that, but I think that a large proportion may not recognize it. I mean, I have lovely surgical friends who have a good work-life balance and manage, but they would have chosen, I think, if I'd chosen wisely, there are certain specialties that would be a lot easier. It's just that I love the guts. I'm very sorry. I can't do eyes or other stuff.
I think
God made people differently.
I think we'll draw that one to a close. I think it will be interesting after today to go back, and it's all recorded. We'll be able to look at this information. and censor some of it. But it will be interesting to make some comparisons, because from what you were just saying in answer to that rather good question, will be very interesting to put alongside what Nathan was saying with a definition of idolatry. And it's where something that's important and good and worth doing then becomes something you worship, isn't it? It's where it goes. You were asking where the line is that you cross over. That's it. It's when you worship it. So anyway, we need to stop now. Before we have a lunch break, Gavin is going to give us a little bit of information. So would you like just to thank Cecilia?
Yeah, so I'm just here to hawk what we call the CAKE network. So they've got leaflets at the back, and CAKE is an acronym, and there is not really a prize, but you can guess. And the best guess, I might come up with a prize later for what that acronym is, but CAKE is the network that Christians in Science has set up of all the kind of organizations in the UK that are involved with science and church and Christianity. So we've got CIS, we kind of like look after people, and we're a fellowship. There's groups there that work with schools, there's a podcast, there's groups there that work with church leadership or with teenagers. So we all try now to work together a little bit more and try and be a little bit more coordinated. So if you want to know more about that, you can come and speak to me. Sam comes to it sometimes as well, so he's a good member of it. But just to let you know that there's more going on than you might realize. And we're trying to work together a bit more as well and be more intentional about what we're doing here in this country as well. So we'll break now until about 2 o'clock for lunch, which is being served out in the front there. Thank you.